What would you do if you discovered that a bank employee you'd been driving was planning to rob her own workplace, and the only way to save her life was to risk everything you'd built for your family? This is the true story of Michael Johnson, a 44-year-old rideshare driver from Chicago who had 60 seconds to choose between tackling an armed killer or watching three innocent people die. A man who learned that sometimes being ordinary is exactly what makes you extraordinary. It all started with a phone call at 3:17 a.m. The city's neon lights blurred through his windshield like watercolor paint bleeding across wet paper. At 44, Michael had been driving for rideshare companies for 6 years, ever since the factory where he'd worked for 18 years closed down. Every night he navigated these same streets, picking up strangers who climbed into his back seat with their problems, their secrets, their lives spilling out in fragments during rides across the city. Tonight felt different. Maybe it was the storm, or maybe it was the phone call from his daughter Emma earlier that evening, her voice tight with worry about her college tuition payment that was due in 3 weeks. Michael had promised her he'd figure it out, the same promise he'd made every month for the past 2 years. His second job at the warehouse barely covered their basic expenses, and every dollar from driving went toward Emma's education. She was the first person in their family who had a real chance at something better. The notification on his phone chimed, pulling him from his thoughts. A pickup at First National Bank on Morrison Street. Michael knew that location well, a small neighborhood branch that stayed open late for customer service. He'd picked up Amanda Foster from that same spot dozens of times over the past 3 months. She always requested the same driver, always seemed grateful for the consistency in an inconsistent world. Amanda was different from most passengers. She didn't spend their ride staring at her phone or making loud business calls. Instead, she would sit quietly in the passenger seat, sometimes making small talk about the weather or asking about Emma when she noticed the graduation photo hanging from his rearview mirror. There was something about Amanda that reminded Michael of his younger sister Sarah, a gentleness that made you want to protect her from whatever was causing the sadness that always seemed to linger in her eyes. But tonight Amanda wasn't just sad. She was terrified. And what she was about to tell Michael would force him to make a choice that could cost him everything he'd worked for. Michael pulled up to the bank's side entrance, where Amanda usually waited. The building stood dark, except for the security lights casting long shadows across the empty parking lot. He checked his phone. 11:52 p.m. Amanda's shift at the bank ended at 11:30, and she was always punctual. Michael had never had to wait more than 2 or 3 minutes for her to appear. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Michael's instincts, sharpened by years of night driving in Chicago, began sending up warning signals. He'd learned to read situations quickly, which neighborhoods to avoid after midnight, which passengers might cause trouble, which streets felt wrong on any given night. Something about the empty parking lot and Amanda's absence felt wrong. His phone buzzed with a text message from Amanda's number. "Running late, please wait. Really need the ride tonight." Michael settled back in his seat, rain drumming steadily on the roof of his car. Through the diner window across the street he could see the usual late-night crowd. A few truckers, some hospital workers getting off shift, and a couple of people who looked like they had nowhere else to go. The warm light spilling from the diner's windows made everything outside seem darker by comparison. 20 minutes later, Amanda finally emerged from the bank's side door. Even from a distance, Michael could see that something was wrong. Her usually confident stride had been replaced by quick, nervous steps. She kept looking over her shoulder as she hurried toward his car, clutching her purse against her chest like it contained something precious or dangerous. When she climbed into the passenger seat, Michael immediately noticed the change in her demeanor. Amanda's hands were shaking as she fastened her seatbelt, and her face was pale in the glow of the dashboard lights. Her auburn hair, usually neatly styled, was disheveled, and there were dark circles under her green eyes that hadn't been there the week before. Amanda gave her address in Riverside, the same middle-class neighborhood where she'd been living since Michael started driving her. But her voice cracked when she spoke, and she kept glancing at the bank building as they pulled away from the curb. For the first few minutes of the drive, they rode in silence. Michael had learned that some passengers needed quiet, needed time to decompress from whatever stress had filled their day. But as they stopped at a red light on Ashland Avenue, Amanda suddenly spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but her words hit Michael like a physical blow. She told him about her brother, Danny, about the gambling debts that had spiraled out of control, about the dangerous men who had visited her mother's house asking questions. She told him about the threats, about the promises that their mother would be safe if Amanda just helped with one small thing. Amanda's next words made Michael realize he wasn't just driving someone home. He was sitting next to someone who was about to become an accessory to armed robbery. As they drove through the quiet residential streets, Amanda's story poured out in broken sentences and half-finished thoughts. Danny owed $47,000 to people who didn't accept late payments or payment plans. Her mother, 68 years old and diabetic, lived alone in the same house where Amanda and Danny had grown up. The men who came looking for Danny made it clear that family members were acceptable collateral for unpaid debts. Michael listened, his hands tightening on the steering wheel as the familiar weight of impossible choices settled in his chest. He'd felt the same weight 22 years ago when his sister Sarah had called him, crying, telling him about her boyfriend's escalating violence. Michael had been young then, barely 22 himself, working his first job at the factory and trying to stay out of other people's problems. He'd told Sarah to call the police, to go to a shelter, to handle it herself. 3 weeks later, Sarah was dead. Amanda continued talking, her voice growing stronger as she described the plan Danny had outlined. She knew the bank security system, knew which cameras had blind spots, knew that the night deposit vault could be accessed through the employee entrance. Danny had been planning this for months, studying the patterns, identifying the vulnerabilities. All he needed was someone on the inside to leave a specific door unlocked and disable one particular alarm. The plan was supposed to be simple and clean. Danny and his partner would enter through the employee entrance at 2:30 a.m. when the security guard made his hourly rounds to the opposite side of the building. They would have 12 minutes to access the night deposit vault and leave before the guard returned. No weapons, no violence, no confrontation. Just enough cash to pay off Danny's debts and give their mother some peace. Michael found himself pulling into Amanda's neighborhood, the tree-lined streets quiet except for the occasional dog barking or the distant sound of late-night television through someone's window. But instead of heading directly to her apartment, he turned into the parking lot of a 24-hour convenience store, needing a few more minutes to process what he'd just heard. Amanda looked at him with confusion and growing panic in her eyes. She asked him if he was going to turn her in, if he was calling the police right now. Her voice carried the desperation of someone who had been carrying an impossible burden alone for too long. Michael turned off the engine and looked at Amanda directly. In the harsh fluorescent light from the convenience store, she looked younger than her 31 years, vulnerable and scared. He recognized the expression on her face, the same look his sister had worn during that last phone call, the look of someone who had run out of good options and was being forced to choose between bad ones and worse ones. What Michael said next would either save Amanda's life or ruin his daughter's future. Because getting involved meant risking everything he'd worked for Emma, and staying silent meant watching another person he cared about make a choice that would destroy them.
Before we continue, tell us where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing.
Michael had never told any of his passengers about Sarah. The guilt and regret from her death had shaped every decision he'd made for the past 2 decades, but he'd kept those wounds private, buried beneath the daily routine of work and responsibility. Now, sitting in a convenience store parking lot with Amanda crying softly beside him, he felt those old wounds tearing open.
He told Amanda about Sarah, about the phone calls he'd ignored and the warning signs he'd dismissed. He told her about the funeral, about the promises he'd made to himself to never again choose the easy path when someone needed help. But he also told her about Emma, about the college tuition that consumed every extra dollar he earned, about the daughter whose future depended on his ability to keep working, keep driving, keep staying out of trouble. Amanda listened without interrupting, her tears falling steadily as Michael's story unfolded. When he finished talking, they sat in silence for several minutes, both of them staring out at the empty parking lot and the neon signs advertising lottery tickets and cheap beer. Amanda finally spoke, her voice hoarse from crying. She told Michael that she understood his position, that she didn't expect him to risk his family for hers. But she also told him about her mother's medication, about the insulin that cost $300 a month, and the rent payments that barely got made even when Amanda worked overtime at the bank. She told him about Danny's history of addiction and bad decisions, but also about the little brother who had protected her from her father's drunken rages and worked 2 jobs to help pay for her business school degree. The complexity of the situation settled around them like the late-night quiet of the city. There were no clear answers, no obviously right choices. Amanda wasn't a criminal. She was a woman trapped between love for her family and knowledge of what was legally and morally right. Danny wasn't an evil person. He was an addict who had made a series of progressively worse decisions and was now trying to protect his mother the only way he knew how. Michael started the car and continued driving toward Amanda's apartment, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The radio played softly in the background, some late-night talk show discussing local politics and community issues. The irony wasn't lost on Michael. Here they were, 2 ordinary people facing an extraordinary moral dilemma while radio hosts debated abstract concepts of right and wrong. As they pulled into the parking lot of Amanda's apartment complex, she turned to him with a look of resignation that broke his heart. She thanked him for listening, for not judging her, for being someone she could trust with the truth. She told him that she knew what she had to do, that she couldn't be part of a robbery no matter what it might cost her family. But Michael could see in her eyes that she was lying, that the weight of her mother's safety and Danny's debts was too much for her to bear alone. He watched her walk toward her apartment building, her shoulders slumped with defeat, and realized that Amanda was going to go through with the plan. She was going to help her brother rob the bank because she couldn't see any other way to protect the people she loved. Michael had exactly 18 hours before the robbery would happen. 18 hours to decide whether to save Amanda from herself, even if it meant destroying his own carefully built life. The drive home took Michael through the industrial section of the city, where he'd worked for 18 years before the plant closure. The massive building stood empty now, their windows dark and broken, weeds growing through cracks in the parking lots. Seeing those abandoned structures always reminded Michael of how quickly stability could disappear, how a single decision by people in distant corporate offices could eliminate hundreds of jobs and destroy entire communities. His apartment was dark when he arrived home. Emma was spending the night at her friend Jessica's house, working on a group project for her psychology class. Michael was grateful for the solitude. He needed time to think without having to pretend that everything was normal. He sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee that grew cold while he stared at the pile of bills that always seemed to multiply faster than his ability to pay them. Emma's tuition bill sat on top of the stack, the final payment due date circled in red ink. $3,400. It might as well have been $34,000 for all the realistic chance Michael had of coming up with that amount in the next 3 weeks. The apartment felt smaller than usual as Michael paced between the kitchen and living room, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. He could call the police and report what Amanda had told him. The robbery would be stopped, Amanda would be arrested as an accomplice, and Michael would go back to his regular routine of driving strangers around the city. But Amanda would lose her job, face criminal charges, and her mother would be left vulnerable to Danny's creditors. He could try to convince Amanda to change her mind, to find another solution. But what other solution existed? Danny's debts weren't going to disappear, and the men he owed money to were not known for their patience or flexibility. Amanda probably already explored every legal option available to her. Michael could stay silent, pretend the conversation had never happened, and hope that Amanda and Danny's plan would work without anyone getting hurt. but he'd spent 22 years living with the consequences of staying silent when someone needed help. He'd promised himself after Sarah's death that he would never again choose inaction when action might save a life. The fourth option was the one that terrified Michael the most: getting directly involved, trying to help Amanda find a different solution, even if it meant risking his own security and Emma's future. This choice carried the highest potential cost and the lowest likelihood of success. But it was also the only choice that offered any real hope of saving Amanda without destroying her. At 2:47 a.m., Michael made the call that would change everything. But the person who answered wasn't who he expected, and their proposal would force Michael into the most dangerous situation of his life. Michael had been staring at his phone for over an hour, Amanda's contact information glowing on the screen. He had typed and deleted a dozen text messages, none of them capturing what he wanted to say. How do you tell someone that you're willing to risk everything to help them without sounding either naive or self-serving? When he finally called, Amanda answered on the first ring, her voice thick with exhaustion and anxiety. She had been unable to sleep, sitting at her own kitchen table and staring at the employee access card that would give Danny and his partner entry to the bank. The weight of what she was about to do had settled over her like a physical burden, making it difficult to breathe or think clearly. Michael told Amanda that he wanted to help her find another way, that there had to be an alternative to robbery that would protect her family without destroying her life. Amanda's response was a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. She couldn't understand why a virtual stranger would be willing to involve himself in her problems. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at Amanda's apartment door. Even through the phone, Michael could hear the tension in Amanda's voice as she asked him to hold on. He listened to muffled voices, Amanda's fearful responses to questions he couldn't quite make out. When she returned to the phone, her voice was shaking. Danny had arrived with his partner, a man named Rico, whom Amanda had met only once before. They'd come to review the final details of the plan and to make sure Amanda understood her role. But Rico had noticed Amanda's agitated state and become suspicious that she might be having second thoughts about helping them. Amanda whispered into the phone that Rico was asking about her recent phone calls, about whether she talked to anyone about their plans. Danny was trying to calm his partner down, but Rico's paranoia was escalating. He had pulled out a gun and was suggesting that maybe Amanda couldn't be trusted to keep their secret, that maybe they needed to find a different solution to their problem. Michael could hear Amanda's panicked breathing through the phone as she tried to convince Rico that she was committed to helping them, but her fear was making her voice shake, and Rico was interpreting her nervousness as evidence of betrayal. The situation was spiraling out of control, and Michael realized that Amanda was in immediate physical danger. Without fully considering the consequences, Michael told Amanda to put him on speakerphone. His voice, calm and authoritative from years of dealing with difficult passengers and dangerous situations, cut through the tension in Amanda's apartment. He introduced himself as Amanda's friend and told Rico that he was aware of their plan and supportive of it.
Rico's response was immediate and aggressive. He demanded to know who Michael was, how much he knew, and whether he represented a threat to their operation. Michael found himself improvising, telling Rico that he was a driver with extensive knowledge of police patrol patterns and escape routes, someone who could be valuable to their plan. Michael had just talked his way into the middle of an armed robbery, but what he discovered next about Rico's real plan would make him realize that Amanda's life was in more danger than anyone had imagined. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Michael had experienced in his 44 years. Rico was clearly the dominant personality in the partnership with Danny, someone accustomed to controlling situations through intimidation and violence. But he was also smart enough to recognize that Michael's offer of assistance could be genuinely valuable to their operation. Rico demanded that Michael come to Amanda's apartment immediately to discuss his potential involvement in person, The implication was clear. Michael wasn't really being invited, he was being summoned. Refusing wasn't an option that would end well for either him or Amanda. During the 20-minute drive to Amanda's apartment, Michael's mind raced through everything he knew about crisis situations and de-escalation techniques. His years of driving had exposed him to countless human dramas, domestic disputes, drug deals, custody exchanges, and emotional breakdowns. He'd learned to read people quickly, to identify who was genuinely dangerous and who was just desperate. Amanda's apartment building was typical of Chicago's middle-class neighborhoods, well-maintained but not luxurious, safe but not prestigious. Michael had dropped Amanda off here dozens of times, but he'd never been inside the building. As he climbed the stairs to her third-floor apartment, he could feel his heart racing with a combination of fear and determination. Danny answered the door, and Michael immediately saw the family resemblance between him and Amanda. They shared the same green eyes and auburn hair, but Danny's face showed the toll of years of addiction and bad decisions. He was thinner than he should have been, his hands slightly shaky, his eyes darting nervously between Michael and the hallway behind him. Rico was a different story entirely. He was larger than Michael had expected, with the kind of build that suggested either military service or serious time in prison. His eyes were cold and calculating as he studied Michael, looking for signs of deception or weakness. A pistol was tucked into his waistband, visible but not immediately threatening. The interior of Amanda's apartment was neat and modest, filled with the kind of furniture that suggested someone who worked hard for everything they owned. Family photographs covered one wall, Amanda and Danny as children, their parents at various ages, their mother receiving some kind of community service award. The contrast between the wholesome family images and the current situation was jarring. Rico wasted no time on pleasantries. He wanted to know exactly who Michael was, how he'd become involved in their business, and what skills he brought to their operation. Michael found himself drawing on every piece of knowledge he'd accumulated about Chicago's streets, police procedures, and escape routes. He talked about shift changes, radio frequencies, traffic patterns, and surveillance blind spots with an authority that surprised even himself. But as the conversation progressed, Michael began to realize that Rico's plan extended far beyond a simple robbery. Rico was asking questions about Amanda's daily routine, her relationships with coworkers, her living situation. He wanted to know who might miss her if she disappeared for a few days, who might come looking for her if she didn't show up for work. The horrible truth began to dawn on Michael as he listened to Rico's detailed questions. This wasn't just a robbery, it was an elimination plan. Rico intended to use Amanda to access the bank, steal the money, and then kill both Amanda and Danny to eliminate any witnesses who could identify him. Amanda's knowledge of his identity and involvement made her a liability that Rico had no intention of leaving alive. Michael had stumbled into a death trap disguised as a robbery. With less than 12 hours before Rico's plan would unfold, he had to find a way to save Amanda and Danny without getting all three of them killed.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The realization that Amanda and Danny were unknowingly walking into their own execution hit Michael like a physical blow. He managed to keep his expression neutral while his mind raced through possible responses to this new information. Rico was still talking, outlining logistics and timing, but Michael was no longer really listening. Instead, he was studying the apartment layout, noting exits and potential weapons, calculating distances and response times. Amanda sat quietly on her couch, her face pale but determined. She clearly had no idea that Rico intended to kill her after the robbery. Danny seemed more aware of his partner's dangerous nature.
But he was so desperate to resolve his debt situation that he was willing to ignore the warning signs his instincts were probably sending him. Rico's plan was sophisticated and thorough. He'd studied the bank's security systems, identified the optimal timing for their entry, and mapped out escape routes that would take them through areas with minimal police presence. But woven throughout his legitimate planning were small details that revealed his true intentions, references to cleaning up loose ends and making sure there were no complications afterwards. Rico realized that he was trapped in an impossible situation. He couldn't reveal his knowledge of Rico's real plan without immediately becoming a target himself, but he also couldn't allow Amanda and Danny to proceed with the plan that would result in their deaths. He needed to find a way to save them without alerting Rico to his awareness of the true situation. As the planning session continued, Michael began looking for opportunities to communicate with Amanda privately, but Rico was too experienced and paranoid to allow any unsupervised conversations. He kept all three of them together, controlling the flow of information and maintaining his psychological dominance over the group. The clock on Amanda's kitchen wall showed 4:23 a.m. In less than 10 hours, the bank robbery would begin. Rico announced that they would spend the remaining time at the apartment, reviewing the plan and making sure everyone understood their roles. He made it clear that no one would be leaving until it was time to drive to the bank. Michael found himself essentially held prisoner along with Amanda and Danny. He allowed him to call Emma and explain that he would be working an extended shift and wouldn't be home until the following evening. The normalcy of that phone call, Emma sleepily asking if he'd eaten dinner and reminding him to be careful driving, provided a stark contrast to the deadly situation he was actually facing. As the morning hours passed, Michael observed Rico more carefully, looking for weaknesses or opportunities. Rico was clearly experienced with criminal operations, but he was also showing signs of drug use, sudden tremors in his hands, excessive alertness, and an underlying agitation that suggested stimulant abuse. This made him more dangerous in some ways, but it also meant that his judgment might be impaired at crucial moments. Danny was becoming increasingly nervous as the time approached, asking repeated questions about the plan and expressing doubts about their ability to complete the robbery without getting caught. Rico's responses to Danny's anxiety were becoming more aggressive, and Michael could see that Rico was losing patience with his partner's weakness. Amanda remained the calmest of the group, her natural composure serving her well under pressure. But Michael could see the fear in her eyes whenever she thought no one was looking. She understood that she was committed to a course of action that could destroy her life, but she believed it was her only option for protecting her mother and brother.
With 2 hours left before the robbery, Michael made a desperate decision that would either save 3 lives or get them all killed. But first, he had to make the most important phone call of his life. At 12:30 p.m., Rico announced that it was time to begin final preparations. He wanted Amanda to call in sick to work, establishing her absence from the bank during normal business hours. Danny was instructed to drive by the bank and confirm that the usual security patterns were in place. Michael was told to prepare his car for multiple passengers and plan the most efficient route to the bank. But Rico made a critical mistake in his operational security. He allowed Michael to go to his car alone to check the fuel level and clean the windows, wanting the vehicle to be inconspicuous and ready for a quick escape. This gave Michael his first opportunity to act without direct supervision. Sitting in his Honda Civic in Amanda's apartment parking lot, Michael pulled out his phone and made the most difficult call of his life. But he didn't call the police. Instead, he called Emma. His daughter answered on the second ring, her voice bright with the energy of someone who had spent the morning in classes and was looking forward to an afternoon of studying with friends. Michael had rehearsed what he wanted to say, but hearing Emma's voice made the words stick in his throat. He told Emma that he loved her,
that everything he had done for the past 22 years had been motivated by his desire to give her opportunities he never had. He told her that she was strong and smart and capable of achieving anything she set her mind to, regardless of what happened with college tuition or family circumstances. Emma, confused by the serious tone of the conversation, asked if something was wrong. Michael assured her that everything was fine, but he wanted her to know that if something unexpected happened, she should contact her Aunt Marie and remember that she had family who would help her finish her education. The call lasted less than 5 minutes, but it gave Michael the emotional strength he needed to proceed with the plan that had been forming in his mind throughout the morning. He wasn't going to call the police and hope they could resolve the situation without anyone getting hurt. He was going to take direct action to save Amanda and Danny, even if it meant risking his own life in the process. Michael's plan was simple in concept, but dangerous in execution. He would wait until they arrived at the bank, then create a distraction that would force Rico to focus on him instead of Amanda and Danny. This would give them an opportunity to escape while Michael dealt with Rico directly. It wasn't a sophisticated plan, but it was the best option available given the circumstances and time constraints. When Michael returned to Amanda's apartment, Rico was reviewing the final details with Amanda and Danny. The robbery was scheduled to begin at 2:30 a.m. during the security guard's scheduled break. They would enter through the employee entrance, access the night deposit vault, and be gone within 12 minutes. Rico estimated they would steal between $30,000 and $50,000, enough to pay off Danny's debts and provide some additional security for the family. But Michael now knew that Rico had no intention of letting Amanda and Danny live to enjoy their share of the money. The robbery was simply a convenient cover for a double murder that would eliminate 2 witnesses and allow Rico to keep all the stolen cash for himself. Amanda looked at Michael with a mixture of gratitude and apology in her eyes. She understood that his involvement in the robbery would put his own family at risk, but she also knew that she had no other options for protecting her mother and brother. The weight of dragging an innocent person into her family's crisis was clearly weighing on her conscience. Danny seemed oblivious to the undercurrents of tension in the room. He was focused entirely on the logistics of the robbery and the prospect of finally resolving his debt crisis. His addiction had narrowed his perspective to the point where he couldn't see beyond the immediate problem, couldn't recognize the larger dangers they were all facing. At 2:15 a.m., as they drove towards the bank, Michael realized that saving Amanda and Danny would require him to become someone he'd never been before. But the biggest shock was still waiting for him in the bank's parking lot. The drive to First National Bank took place in tense silence. Rico sat in the front passenger seat, his hand resting on the pistol in his waistband, his eyes constantly scanning the streets for signs of police activity. Amanda and Danny sat in the back seat, both of them staring out their respective windows at the city they'd grown up in, possibly seeing it for the last time. Michael drove carefully, obeying all traffic laws and maintaining normal speeds. The last thing they needed was to be stopped by police for a routine traffic violation. But his mind was racing through the final details of his plan, calculating timing and positioning for the confrontation he knew was coming. The bank parking lot was empty, except for a single security vehicle parked near the main entrance. Rico observed the scene for several minutes, confirming that the security guard was following his usual pattern. Everything appeared to be proceeding according to Rico's expectations. But as they prepared to exit Michael's car, a second vehicle pulled into the parking lot. Michael's heart sunk when he recognized the driver, Officer Kevin Walsh, the patrol cop who had been investigating suspicious activity around the bank for the past several weeks. Rico's reaction was immediate and violent. He pulled out his pistol and pointed it at Amanda's head, his voice low and threatening as he told everyone to remain calm and quiet. Walsh's patrol car was about 50 feet away, close enough that any sudden movement or sound would attract his attention. Michael realized that his plan to create a distraction inside the bank was no longer viable. The presence of a police officer had changed the entire dynamic of the situation.
Rico was now trapped between proceeding with a robbery under police surveillance or aborting the mission and potentially facing retaliation from Danny's creditors. But Rico made a decision that revealed the true depths of his criminal experience and ruthlessness. Instead of aborting the robbery, he decided to eliminate Officer Walsh as well. He instructed Michael to drive closer to Walsh's vehicle, claiming he wanted to assess whether Walsh had noticed their presence. As they approached Walsh's vehicle, Michael could see the officer sitting inside, completing paperwork and occasionally scanning the parking lot through his windows. Walsh was young, probably early 30s, with the kind of alert posture that suggested he took his job seriously. He had no idea that he was about to become a target. Rico's plan was to have Michael approach Walsh's car and create a distraction while Rico positioned himself for a surprise attack. Once Walsh was eliminated, they would proceed with the bank robbery as originally planned. The presence of a dead police officer would complicate the investigation, but would also provide additional time before the robbery was discovered. Michael knew that he had reached the moment of truth. He could either participate in the murder of a police officer and the robbery of a bank, or he could take action to prevent both crimes. There was no middle ground, no compromise solution that would satisfy everyone's needs. As Michael parked his car near Walsh's patrol vehicle, he made his choice. Instead of following Rico's instructions, he rolled down his window and called out to Officer Walsh, identifying himself as a concerned citizen who had information about suspicious activity. Rico's response was instantaneous and predictable. He pressed the barrel of his pistol against the back of Michael's neck and threatened to kill him immediately if he said another word. But Michael had already committed to his course of action, and he knew that hesitation would result in the deaths of everyone in the car.
In the next 60 seconds, Michael would either save 4 lives or lose everything he'd ever cared about. The choice he made would define not just his own fate, but the kind of man his daughter would remember him as. Officer Walsh approached Michael's car with the cautious professionalism of someone who had dealt with countless late-night situations that could turn dangerous without warning. He kept one hand near his service weapon while using a flashlight to illuminate the interior of Michael's vehicle. What he saw immediately triggered his training and instincts. 4 people in a car outside a bank at 2:30 a.m. with visible signs of extreme tension and fear. Michael spoke quickly but clearly, his voice steady despite the gun pressed against his neck. He told Walsh that the man beside him was armed and planning to rob the bank, that the 2 people in the back seat were being coerced into participating, and that Walsh needed to call for backup immediately. Rico's reaction was exactly what Michael had expected. He shifted his aim from Michael to Walsh, threatening to kill the police officer if he didn't back away from the car. But Rico had made a tactical error by revealing his weapon and intentions to a trained law enforcement officer. Walsh immediately drew his own pistol and called for emergency backup while taking cover behind his patrol car. What happened next unfolded with the chaotic speed of a life-or-death confrontation. Rico forced Amanda and Danny out of the car at gunpoint, using them as human shields while he tried to retreat toward the bank building. Michael, no longer directly threatened by Rico's weapon, made a split-second decision that drew on every ounce of courage and determination he possessed. He opened his car door and charged directly at Rico, tackling him from behind and causing him to lose his grip on both his pistol and his human shields. The 2 men crashed to the asphalt of the parking lot, fighting for control of the weapon that had skittered away from them across the pavement. Michael had never been in a serious physical fight in his adult life. He wasn't trained in combat or self-defense, didn't possess any special physical abilities or martial arts skills. But he was fighting for something more important than his own survival. He was fighting for Amanda's life, for Danny's redemption, for the chance to finally make the right choice when someone needed help. The fight lasted less than 30 seconds, but it felt like an eternity to Michael.
Rico was stronger and more experienced with the violence, but he was also impaired by drugs and caught off guard by Michael's unexpected attack. He managed to keep Rico away from the pistol until Walsh could safely approach and take control of the situation. As Rico was handcuffed and placed in the back of Walsh's patrol car, Amanda and Danny stood together in the parking lot, holding each other and crying with relief. The robbery had been prevented, Rico's plan to kill them had been exposed, and they were all still alive. But Michael knew that their problems weren't completely solved. Danny still owed $47,000 to dangerous people. Their mother still needed expensive medication and care. Amanda would still face questions about her knowledge of the planned robbery, even though she'd been coerced into participation. The legal and financial challenges that had created this crisis hadn't disappeared just because the immediate threat had been eliminated. But something fundamental had changed for all three of them. Amanda had discovered that she was stronger than she realized, that she could survive the worst kind of fear and pressure without losing her moral center. Danny had seen the ultimate consequences of his addiction and poor choices, and he was finally ready to accept help and begin the difficult process of recovery. And Michael had finally answered the question that had haunted him for 22 years. When someone needed help, when the choice was between safety and service, between self-interest and sacrifice, he had chosen to act. He had chosen to be the person his sister needed him to be, even though it was too late to save her. Epilogue. 6 months later. Michael still drives for rideshare companies, still picks up strangers with their problems and their secrets, but Emma's tuition is being paid through a combination of scholarship she earned after writing her college application essay about her father's courage, a part-time job Amanda helped her find at the bank, and contributions from a legal defense fund that was established after Michael's story became public. Amanda works as a victim advocate, helping other people who find themselves trapped between family loyalty and legal obligation. She speaks regularly at community centers and schools about recognizing the signs of financial abuse and finding legitimate resources for crisis situations. Danny completed a residential treatment program and now works as a counselor for other people struggling with gambling addiction. His debt was eventually resolved through a combination of community support, legal intervention against the illegal lending operation, and a payment plan that allowed him to rebuild his life without destroying his family. Officer Walsh was promoted to detective and now specializes in financial crimes that target vulnerable families. He credits Michael with teaching him to look beyond surface appearances and recognize when ordinary people are being forced into extraordinary circumstances. The ripple effects of that night at First National Bank continued to spread through their community. Michael's story has been told at community meetings, written about in local newspapers, and shared as an example of how individual moral courage can create positive change. But for Michael himself, the most important outcome is simpler and more personal. He no longer lies awake at night wondering what would have happened if he'd made different choices 22 years ago. He knows that when faced with the same type of decision that had haunted him since Sarah's death, he chose to act rather than stand aside. He chose to risk everything he'd built in order to save people who needed help, even though those people were virtual strangers to him. Emma, now thriving in her junior year of college, tells people that her father is her hero, not because he's famous or wealthy or particularly talented, but because when it mattered most, he chose to be the kind of person who puts others' welfare ahead of his own safety. She says that watching her father risk everything to save Amanda and Danny taught her that ordinary people have the power to create extraordinary change in the world. Michael still picks up Amanda from the hospital occasionally when her car is being repaired or when she's working late. They don't talk much about that night anymore. The trauma has faded, and they've all moved forward with their lives. But sometimes when they're stopped at a red light or waiting in traffic, Amanda will look over at Michael and simply say, "Thank you." Not for the ride, but for the choice he made to see her as someone worth saving.
The bank parking lot where everything happened looks exactly the same as it did that night 6 months ago. The security lights still cast the same shadows, the patrol cars still make their regular rounds, and people still go about their daily business without realizing how close they came to witnessing a tragedy. But for Michael, Amanda, Danny, and everyone whose lives they've touched since then, that parking lot represents something different. It represents the moment when an ordinary person discovered that they had the power to change the course of multiple lives through a single act of moral courage. It represents the truth that heroes aren't born with special abilities or chosen by destiny. They're made by the choices they make when no one is watching and when doing the right thing costs them more than they can afford to lose. The story of Michael Johnson, Amanda Foster, and Danny Martinez has become part of their community's collective memory, a reminder that ordinary people facing impossible choices can still choose to do extraordinary things. It's a story about the power of moral courage, the importance of human connection, and the truth that sometimes the biggest difference in the world is not made by people with special abilities, but by people with the simple willingness to care about strangers as much as they care about themselves.
And in a city of millions, where thousands of stories unfold every day in the back seats of cars and the quiet corners of ordinary lives, Michael's story continues to inspire others to make the same choice he made, to see someone in need, to recognize their own power to help, and to choose action over safety when someone's life hangs in the balance. But the full impact of that night extends far beyond the 3 people directly involved. Officer Walsh's report about the incident led to a broader investigation of illegal lending operations in Chicago. The criminal network that had trapped Danny and dozens of other victims was eventually dismantled, with 17 arrests and the recovery of over $2 million in illegal profits. Families across the city were freed from predatory lending schemes that had been destroying their lives for years. The bank where Amanda worked implemented new security protocols and employee support programs after learning how one of their trusted employees had been coerced into participating in a robbery attempt. Other financial institutions across the state adopted similar programs, recognizing that employees facing personal crises could become unwilling security vulnerabilities. Michael's story was featured in a documentary about ordinary heroes, bringing national attention to the issue of how everyday people can make extraordinary differences in their communities. The documentary led to speaking engagements at conferences and universities, where Michael shared his experience with audiences who were inspired to look for opportunities to help others in their own lives. But perhaps the most meaningful impact occurred in the quieter moments, in the individual interactions that grew out of Michael's example. Amanda's work as a victim advocate has helped hundreds of people find legal alternatives to desperate choices. Danny's counseling has guided dozens of recovering addicts through the difficult process of rebuilding their lives without destroying their families. Walsh's specialized detective work has prevented other families from falling victim to financial predators. Emma Johnson, now in her senior year of college, has changed her major to social work, inspired by her father's example, and determined to build a career around helping people navigate impossible situations. She volunteers at the same community center where Danny now works, and she's planning to pursue graduate studies in crisis intervention and family counseling. The ripple effects continue to spread in ways that Michael could never have anticipated. A teacher in Detroit read about Michael's story and decided to intervene when she noticed signs that one of her students was being abused at home. A businessman in Phoenix chose to offer job training and second chances to formerly incarcerated individuals after learning about Danny's successful recovery. A police officer in Miami began looking more carefully at financial crimes that target immigrant families, recognizing patterns of vulnerability that had previously been invisible to him. Each of these secondary impacts created their own ripple effects, spreading outward through communities and touching lives that would never know Michael's name, but benefited from the example he set during 60 seconds of moral courage in a bank parking lot. The apartment where Michael still lives is filled with letters and emails from people who have heard his story and been inspired to take action in their own situations. A grandmother in Texas who stood up to her grandson's drug dealers. A college student in Florida who refused to participate in academic fraud despite threats to her scholarship. A construction worker in Nevada who reported safety violations despite risking his job security. Michael keeps these letters in a box beside his bed, reading them when he needs reminders that his choice to help Amanda and Danny continues to influence decisions being made by people he'll never meet. The weight of accidentally becoming a public example of moral courage sometimes feels overwhelming to someone who still thinks of himself as just a driver trying to make ends meet. But Emma helps him understand the broader significance of what he did. She points out that his story resonates with people because it proves that heroism doesn't require special training, exceptional intelligence, or unusual circumstances. It just requires the willingness to recognize when someone needs help and the courage to provide that help, even when doing so carries significant personal risk. The legal aftermath of that night took several months to resolve. Michael testified at Rigo's trial, describing the events that led to the confrontation and the decision to tackle an armed criminal despite having no combat training or law enforcement experience. Rico was convicted of attempted armed robbery, conspiracy, kidnapping, and threatening a police officer, receiving a sentence of 25 years in federal prison. Danny's cooperation with the investigation led to reduced charges for his role in planning the robbery. He received 2 years of probation and was required to complete residential addiction treatment, which became the foundation for his successful recovery and his current work as an addiction counselor. The judge who sentenced Danny noted that his willingness to testify against the broader criminal network demonstrated genuine commitment to changing his life. Amanda faced no charges after prosecutors determined that her involvement in the robbery plan was the result of coercion and threats against her family. Her testimony about Rico's true intentions helped secure his conviction and provided crucial information about the illegal lending operation. She received counseling to help process the trauma of being manipulated and threatened, which led to her career change from banking to victim advocacy. Michael's employer initially expressed concern about his involvement in a criminal investigation, but public support for his actions and positive media coverage transformed their attitude. The rideshare company featured Michael in their safety campaign, highlighting how their drivers serve as informal guardians of community safety. They provided him with a new vehicle and increased insurance coverage, recognizing that his actions had brought positive attention to their brand. The financial stress that had dominated Michael's life for years was significantly reduced through the combination of Emma's scholarship awards, his increased income from speaking engagements, and a legal settlement from the company that had illegally operated the lending scheme that trapped Danny. For the first time since Emma started college, Michael was able to sleep at night without worrying about how to pay her tuition. But the most important change in Michael's life was internal. The guilt and regret that had shaped his decisions for 22 years after his sister's death finally began to fade. Sarah would never know that her brother had eventually found the courage to help someone else who was trapped in an impossible situation, but Michael knew. And that knowledge allowed him to forgive himself for the choices he'd made as a scared 22-year-old who didn't understand the consequences of inaction. The anniversary of that night at First National Bank has become an informal holiday for Michael, Amanda, Danny, and their families. They meet for dinner at the 24-hour diner across the street from the bank, sharing updates about their lives and reflecting on how much has changed since that terrifying confrontation in the parking lot.
These annual dinners have grown to include Officer Walsh, now Detective Walsh, and his family. Emma brings her college friends when she's home, eager to introduce them to the people who helped shape her understanding of moral courage and community responsibility. Amanda's mother, whose health has improved dramatically since the stress of Danny's debt crisis was resolved, always brings homemade desserts and stories about the positive changes she's seen in her neighborhood. Danny, now 3 years sober and engaged to a woman he met in recovery, often brings young people he's counseling to these dinners. He wants them to see that recovery is possible, that families can heal, and that the worst mistakes in life don't have to define the rest of life. His transformation from desperate addict to community counselor serves as proof that people can change when they're given genuine support and opportunities for redemption.
Michael has become something of an accidental philosopher on the subject of moral courage, though he still insists that he's just a driver who happened to make the right choice at a crucial moment. He speaks thoughtfully about the difference between heroism and simple human decency, arguing that most situations requiring moral courage aren't dramatic confrontations, but quiet moments when people choose to get involved instead of looking away. These reflections have led Michael to become more intentional about the small choices he makes every day. He notices passengers who seem distressed and offers genuine concern instead of polite distance. He volunteers at Emma's former high school, talking to students about making difficult decisions and standing up for their values even when it costs them socially or financially. The impact of Michael's example on his passengers has been measurable. Several people have approached him months or years after rides to tell him how his kindness during a difficult moment in their lives helped them through crises or inspired them to seek help for problems they'd been hiding. A business executive used Michael's example of moral courage to justify blowing the whistle on financial fraud at his company. A college student chose to report sexual assault despite social pressure to remain silent. Amanda's work as a victim advocate has brought her into contact with dozens of people facing the same impossible choices she once confronted. Her personal experience with coercion and threats gives her unique credibility when she counsels others about legal alternatives to desperate actions. She's helped prevent several planned crimes by connecting victims with resources and support systems that offer genuine alternatives to illegal solutions. Her presentations at community centers and schools focus on recognizing the warning signs of financial abuse and understanding the legal protections available to people being threatened or coerced. She emphasizes that victims of financial crimes often don't realize they have options because the criminals work hard to isolate them and convince them that cooperation is their only choice for protecting their families. Danny's counseling work has evolved to include specialized programs for people whose addictions have created legal and financial problems that seem insurmountable. He helps clients understand that recovery isn't just about stopping drug use or gambling. It's about rebuilding relationships, developing healthy coping strategies, and learning to make decisions based on long-term consequences rather than immediate desperation. His personal story of nearly destroying his family and then finding a path to redemption resonates powerfully with clients who feel trapped by their own poor choices. Danny doesn't minimize the severity of addiction or promise easy solutions, but he provides living proof that people can recover from devastating mistakes and build meaningful, productive lives. The community center where Danny works has become a model for other cities dealing with the intersection of addiction, financial crime, and family crisis. Delegations from other states have visited to study their integrated approach to addressing the root causes of desperation that drive people toward illegal solutions to legal problems. Detective Walsh's specialized work in financial crimes has led to the development of new police procedures for investigating cases that involve family coercion and threats. He trains other officers to recognize when apparent criminals are actually victims and to understand the complex dynamics that can force law-abiding people into illegal situations. His experience with Michael, Amanda, and Danny taught him that effective law enforcement requires understanding not just what crimes have been committed, but why good people sometimes make bad choices. This perspective has made him more effective at preventing crimes by addressing underlying vulnerabilities, rather than simply responding to criminal actions after they occur. Walsh has testified before state legislative committees about the need for stronger laws against predatory lending and financial intimidation. His recommendations have led to new regulations that make it harder for criminal organizations to trap families in cycles of debt and desperation. These legal changes have prevented thousands of families from experiencing the crisis that nearly destroyed Amanda and Danny's lives. The broader law enforcement community has recognized Walsh as an expert in the field of financial crimes that target vulnerable populations. He speaks regularly at police conferences and training academies, sharing lessons learned from cases like Rico's operation and emphasizing the importance of understanding the human elements that drive criminal behavior. Emma Johnson's decision to pursue social work was directly influenced by her father's experience and the ongoing relationships with Amanda, Danny, and Detective Walsh. She's particularly interested in developing prevention programs that identify people at risk of making desperate choices before they reach crisis points. Her undergraduate research project focused on the psychological and social factors that influence moral decision-making under pressure. She interviewed Michael, Amanda, Danny, and several other people who had faced similar moral dilemmas, looking for patterns in how people choose between self-interest and helping others when the stakes are high.
Emma's research findings supported the conclusion that moral courage is not an innate personality trait, but a skill that can be developed through practice and social support. People who intervene in crisis situations typically have prior experience with smaller acts of helping behavior, and they usually have strong social networks that reinforce pro-social values. These findings have practical implications for community programs designed to promote civic engagement and mutual aid. Emma's research suggests that communities can cultivate cultures of moral courage by creating opportunities for people to practice helping behaviors in low-stakes situations, building the psychological muscle memory that enables decisive action when lives are at stake. Her senior thesis expanded on this research, proposing specific intervention strategies for communities that want to reduce crime by addressing the social conditions that drive good people toward desperate choices. Her work has been recognized by faculty and graduate programs, leading to scholarship offers for master's degree programs in clinical social work and community psychology. The documentary that featured Michael's story was produced independently by a filmmaker who had read about the case in local news coverage. The filmmaker was struck by the ordinariness of the heroes, a driver, a bank teller, and a police officer, and the way their individual choices created expanding circles of positive change throughout their community. The documentary premiered at film festivals in Chicago and New York, winning awards for Best Documentary Short and Best Social Impact Film. It was later broadcast on public television stations across the country, reaching audiences who might never have heard Michael's story otherwise. The film's success led to educational licensing deals that brought Michael's story into high school and college classrooms as a case study in ethics and moral decision-making. International distribution of the documentary introduced Michael's story to audiences in other countries, where it was adapted into local contexts and languages. A version produced for European audiences emphasized the universal nature of moral dilemmas and the common human capacity for extraordinary courage under pressure. Similar adaptations were created for audiences in Asia, Africa, and South America, each one highlighting aspects of Michael's experience that resonated with local cultural values and social challenges. The global reach of Michael's story has led to invitations to speak at international conferences on community safety, moral education, and crime prevention. These speaking engagements have expanded Michael's understanding of how similar dynamics play out in different cultural and economic contexts, reinforcing his belief that the capacity for moral courage is truly universal. But for all the public attention and recognition his story has received, Michael remains most proud of the private moments when his example has influenced someone's decision to help another person. The letters he receives from people who have been inspired by his story continue to arrive regularly, each one describing a moment when someone chose to get involved rather than look away, chose to help rather than ignore, chose to risk something valuable to protect someone vulnerable. These individual acts of moral courage, helping an elderly neighbor, reporting workplace safety violations, intervening in domestic violence situations, supporting someone through addiction recovery, represent the true measure of Michael's impact. Each person who chooses to help because they remember his example creates their own ripple effects, touching lives and preventing crises in ways that can never be fully measured, but continue expanding outward through communities and across generations. Because in the end, that's what heroes really are. Ordinary people who, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, choose to do the right thing regardless of the cost to themselves.
They choose to believe that a stranger's life is worth risking their own security for, and they choose to act on that belief even when they're scared, even when they're not sure it will work, and even when doing nothing would be so much easier. Michael Johnson learned that lesson in a bank parking lot at 2:30 in the morning, and it changed not just his life, but the lives of everyone who has heard his story since. It's a reminder that heroism isn't about superpowers or special training. It's about recognizing the moment when your choice to act or not act will determine whether someone lives or dies, succeeds or fails, finds hope or gives up entirely. And when that moment comes, and it comes for all of us eventually, the only question that matters is simple. What kind of person do you choose to be? The end.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.